In a quiet valley where the loudest sound most days was the rustle of wind through cornfields, something extraordinary was taking shape in an old wooden barn. Not a tractor or a plow, but the frame of a helicopter, piece by stubborn piece rebuilt, by the hands of a teenager who refused to let his father's dream die. For months, neighbors passed by with curious glances, some shaking their heads, others slowing just long enough to wonder what could possibly come of it. But inside, the air smelled of motor oil and grit, the sound of a wrench turning in steady rhythm, the silhouette of a Bell UH-1 Huey slowly returning to life. What no one expected was that this act of determination would draw the attention of the United States Air Force. And before long, military vehicles would roll down that gravel road and stop right outside those barn doors. Before we begin, I want to know something from you. Where in the world are you watching from today? Let me know down in the comments. Because this story isn't just about a machine, it's about every place where hope still gets built with bare hands and belief. The summer air in Redding Valley carried the faint smell of motor oil and hay that seemed to cling to every old barn along the winding dirt roads. But one barn in particular held a sound unlike the others, not the clinking of horseshoes or the hum of milking machines. This was the sharp metallic clatter of tools against aluminum, the measured ratchet of bolts turning into place, and the slow, deliberate grind of sandpaper. Against weathered steel, 17-year-old Caleb Mason worked there. Every day his calloused hands blackened by grease, his hair forever smelling of gasoline. He was the son of John Mason, the best helicopter mechanic the Air Force ever had, until an injury grounded him for good. The barn itself had been their family's sanctuary for years, but now it was cluttered with rotors and panels scavenged from scrapyards. Each piece a fragment of something much bigger to most folks in town. It looked like junk of foolish dream cluttering up a perfectly good farm. But Caleb saw what they could not. He saw the silhouette of a Bell UH-1 Huey taking shape, the same helicopter his father used to maintain back when skies and service were his whole world. It started with a promise Caleb had made 3 years earlier on the day his father came home from the base with a cane in his hand and a faraway look in his eyes. They told him he'd never work on aircraft again. But Caleb saw how his father's fingers still twitched, as if reaching for a wrench, so he told him one day he'd build a helicopter, not for flying in wars, not for the military, just for them, for the joy of hearing an engine roar to life again. But promises in Redding Valley were cheap, and the Mason family's money was thin. The neighbors scoffed behind closed doors, and even Caleb's uncle Henry warned him not to waste his youth chasing fantasies. Still, Caleb worked every spare hour after school, stripping paint from battered panels, welding cracked frames, and studying every schematic he could find on worn-out manuals from the library. His father mostly watched at first, his limp making it hard to move around, but now and then he would shuffle over and correct Caleb's grip on a torque wrench or shake his head with a faint smile. When his son's measurements came up a hair too short by the end of July, the machine actually looked like something that might one day lift off the ground. The frame sat steady, the rotor assembly in place, though the engine was still nothing but scattered parts on the workbench. Caleb's friends came by one humid night, their flashlights sweeping over the hull. They laughed in disbelief until Caleb climbed into the cockpit, his hands on the control, stick eyes alight with that dangerous mix of hope and stubbornness. They didn't say much after that. Still, there was tension at home. John's injury had drained the family's savings, and his disability checks barely kept the lights on. Caleb's mother worried that the time and energy poured into the helicopter could have been used for a real job, something steady. Caleb felt the weight of that every morning when he walked into the barn and smelled the oil and dust. But he also felt something else, the hum of a dream too loud to ignore, and though he couldn't explain it, he felt this project mattered more than anyone could yet understand. One overcast afternoon, as Caleb wrestled the engine mount into position. He heard the crunch of tires on gravel. A dusty pickup rolled up the drive, and a man stepped out in a faded Air Force ball cap. His name was Sergeant Ton Alvarez, retired, but still carrying himself like the tarmac was under his feet. He'd heard about the crazy kid trying to build a Huey in a barn from spare parts, and curiosity had pulled him here. Alvarez walked slow around the machine, his fingers trailing along the rivets. Finally, he looked at Caleb and said quietly, "You keep at this, and you might just surprise a lot of people, kid. You might even surprise." The Air Force Caleb didn't know what to make of that, but he noticed the way his father's eyes lit up hearing those words. It was the first time in years they seemed to see the same. Horizon * Sergeant Alvarez returned the next morning before the sun burned the haze off Redding Valley. He brought a dented thermos and a battered toolbox that looked like it had flown across half the world. He did not talk much at first. He moved around the Huey frame with the slow reverence of a man visiting an old friend. He pointed once to a seam that needed a better rivet pattern, nodded toward the tail boom alignment, and when John shuffled in with his cane and that guarded look he had worn for years, Alvarez snapped a crisp little two-finger salute that was half joke and half ceremony. The air in the barn felt different after that, like a flag had been quietly raised that no one could see, but everyone felt word drifted through town faster than any official notice. By noon, the feed store clerk was asking about the helicopter barn. By evening, Pastor Glenn mentioned it from the church steps as a story about perseverance. And by the next day, Lana Bellamy from the county paper was standing in the doorway with a notebook and kind eyes. She asked questions that did not feel like prying. What made you start? What was the hardest moment? When did you almost give up? And as Caleb answered, he realized how many nearly broken days there had been, and how he had kept going anyway. That night the article ran, and the headline was plain but proud. Mechanic's son rebuilds a Huey in his father's barn. Neighbors read it at breakfast and tried to picture the sound of a rotor turning where cows once slept. Attention is a bright thing, and bright things draw the bugs. 2 afternoons later, a county code inspector named Wallace rolled up in a white sedan that flashed like a tooth. He was not cruel, but he was careful, clipboard in hand, eyes measuring flammable storage and clearance around electrical cords. He talked about liability and property lines and the need for official permits when building anything that might move under its own power. Caleb listened with his fists clenched behind his back. Wallace did not shut them down, but he left a yellow notice that said compliance review in 14 days. Failure to comply may result in penalties. After he drove away, the barn felt colder. The new threat was not ridicule. It was a calendar counting down money became a louder problem than ever. Everything the Huey needed seemed to carry a price that tried to insult their courage. And the worst of it was the heart itself, the turbine, the old T-53 engine. They had a core salvaged from a derelict machine, but the fuel control unit was missing. The very brain that told the engine how to breathe and burn, Caleb held a photocopied diagram late into the night and tried to pretend that ingenuity alone could replace a part that cost more than the farm. Brought in for a season, Alvarez leaned against the fender of his truck and stared at the fields and finally said he knew a man at a desert boneyard who owed him a favor. He could make a call, but favors were a currency, and spending them meant you could not spend them. Later help arrived from places Caleb had not thought to ask. Maya Chun, who sat 2 rows behind him in physics and drew quiet, perfect diagrams in the margins, showed up with a curious smile and a laptop. Her father ran the machine shop near the highway, and they had a small printer that could handle aerospace-grade filament. She said, "If you give me precise measurements, I can print bushings and ducting test fits, so you do not waste aluminum." Caleb stared because he had not even known to want that kind of help. Then Ezekiel Parker, who everyone called Z, a welder, with hands like anvils and a reputation for turning scrap into art, dropped by with a welding helmet painted the color of rusted cherries. He had served 4 years on a Navy deck crew and missed the smell of hot metal. He said, "No pay. Just let me stand near a machine that might breathe again." And he lit his torch. Like a hymn, the barn turned into a workshop with a rhythm. Morning measurements, afternoon fits, evening sanding and rewiring. John found a chair at the edge of the work area and turned into a coach. He could not bend or lift much without fire in his hip. But he could see, he could hear, he could stop. A mistake by tapping his cane against the floor twice and clearing his throat. Every now and then he would slide a small notepad to Caleb with a sketch of a bracket or a warning about a stress point. And Caleb would nod without breaking the flow. Father and son were speaking again, in a language that did not need apologies asterisk. There were people who wanted them to fail. Not because the helicopter was dangerous, but because hope is its own kind of danger. Grant Ellison, the developer who had been buying up parcels for a storage complex just down the road, had made quiet offers on the Mason land for 2 years. Each one a little sweeter and a little more insulting. Rumors said he had friends in county offices. And when Wallace the inspector returned unannounced with a fire safety officer in tow, Caleb caught Ellison's black SUV idling at the corner as if by accident. Wallace read the barn a list like a sermon: secondary exit clearance, extinguisher-type upgrades, proper storage of aviation fuels, documentation of training for anyone near the engine during testing. None of it unreasonable, all of it heavy. 14 days had become 7. The community began to choose sides. Some brought sandwiches and memories. Old veterans who had flown in Vietnam or trained stateside showed up with stories that turned the dusty air gold. A woman named May Whitaker, who once flew medevac missions, leaned a framed photograph against the workbench. "You will need this kind of courage," she said, "not for flying, for waiting, because waiting with a dream is the hardest mission." Others rolled their eyes and muttered about boys and their toys, and accidents waiting to happen. Pastor Glenn organized a potluck to raise funds for new extinguishers and wiring, and he prayed not just for safety, he prayed for purpose, that whatever this machine became, it would bless the valley instead of just stirring it. Then the storm hit, a fat purple line on the radar that Grandpa Jim on the farm next door still trusted more than smartphones. It rolled across the valley in the late afternoon and flattened the light into something flat and pewter. Wind whistled through the plank gaps and rattled every bolt bin on the wall. Water drove under the barn doors in thin silver sheets. Maya and Z and Alvarez and Caleb worked like a hand with 4 fingers, hauling tarps, moving spools of wire to higher ground, locking down the rotor hub with straps that dug lines into their palms. A gust slammed the east door open with a scream, and for a blur of a moment the tail boom twisted under the lash of wind. Caleb lunged, Alvarez braced, Z wedged a timber. The barn settled, the storm passed, and when it was gone, they stood soaked and shaking, looking at each other with the close, stunned laughter of people who just learned they were a team and not. A group after the storm, the world looked newer and a little more used. The next day brought a small gift wrapped in dust, a crate from the desert boneyard, riding in the back of Alvarez's truck. His favor had been spent. Inside lay the fuel control unit, scratched and in need of love, but real, the kind of real that makes prayer feel answered. Maya photographed every angle for a digital twin. Z built a cradle to hold it without stressing the fittings. John ran his fingers over the stamped numbers like a blind man reading a good omen. And for a breathless moment even Caleb let himself imagine. The turbine spooling up and the rotor biting air over the hay fields. Not today, but not never. And that word mattered. Not never they worked, until the barn lights cast soft cones over. Tired faces, the checklist on the wall grew dense. Fuel lines, electrical harness, transmission inspection, tail rotor pitch links, and at the bottom a line that Maya had written in neat letters. Phi a consultation, because to build something is art. To make it safe enough to share is responsibility. John read that line and nodded with a kind of pride that carried no bitterness. Then he carefully wrote underneath, "We do this, right?" Not fast, and no one argued, even with the inspector's date pinning them in place like a butterfly on a card. Because somewhere between the storm and the crate and the shared coffee, they had crossed a line from trying to matter to actually mattering. And once you know that about yourselves, you fight differently. Asterisk. The week before the inspector's return felt like a rope tightening around the barn. Every tick of the clock seemed to echo in the rafters. The to-do list on the wall had shrunk, but what was left was the kind of work you could not rush. Delicate connections that demanded steady hands and patient minds. Caleb found himself waking before sunrise just to get an extra hour in the quiet, when the only sounds were the soft tap of rain on tin and the whisper of a wrench turning. It was in those dawn hours he caught his father watching him from the doorway, cane in hand, the same faint smile he had worn back in the days when they used to fix old farm trucks side by side. On Tuesday, a black sedan rolled up. No county seal this time. The driver wore a crisp blue uniform with silver wings at his chest. He introduced himself as Captain Raymond Holt from Beale Air Force Base. His voice was calm, but there was something in his eyes that said he had seen this barn in his mind long before he drove out here. Alvarez stepped forward, and the two men clasped hands like old comrades. Turns out Holt had served with Alvarez on a desert tarmac a decade ago, and when Alvarez sent him a grainy photo of Caleb's project, Holt asked one question: "Is the kid serious?" Alvarez had answered with a smile. Serious enough to finish. Holt walked slow around the Huey, running his fingers along the fuselage and nodding at the tail rotor assembly. He spoke in short bursts of approval and suggestion. A better routing for the electrical harness, an adjustment to the swash plate alignment. He warned them that the FAA wouldn't care about sentiment, only about compliance. But he also said this: "You finish this the right way, and you might find you've built more than a machine. You might find you've built a bridge." Caleb didn't know exactly what that meant, but he saw the way. Holt's presence seemed to stiffen everyone's spine that night. The barn hummed with purpose. Maya crouched over her laptop feeding measurements into a 3D model. Z welded a bracket that would hold the engine cowling without warping. John sat with Holt and Alvarez, flipping through diagrams of the Huey's original avionics, debating which systems they could replicate safely and which needed to be gutted and rebuilt for civilian operation. It was the most alive the barn had. Felt yet like they were rehearsing for a concert no one in town believed would happen. By Thursday, they decided to run the first silent systems test. No fuel, no ignition, just the full mechanical sweep to see if every moving part could talk. To the others, Caleb sat in the pilot's seat, his hands light on the cyclic and collective. Holt stood outside near the tail rotor, Alvarez by the main mast. Maya read out checklists while Z worked the manual crank. Metal groaned, bearings whispered, and the rotor blades began to turn in the still air, slow at first, then with the rhythm of something remembering its own heartbeat. The barn was filled with the deep thump of air being pushed by something that had been dead for decades. John closed his eyes, and for a moment he was back on the base, smell of jet fuel in the wind, his voice clear and strong as he called out the old maintenance commands. Caleb answered them without thinking. Father and son in sync, as if no years had passed. The test ended with a cheer that shook dust from the rafters. They had found 3 minor alignment issues and 1 loose connection in the tail rotor control, but nothing failed. Maya logged every detail. Z swore they could fix the issues before sundown Friday. It felt like they had climbed a ridge and could finally see the next valley. But valleys have shadows, and that night Caleb found a note slipped under the barn door. No name, just block letters on lined paper. Stop before someone gets hurt. Caleb read the note twice under the dim barn light. The words felt heavier than paper, heavier than ink. They carried the weight of someone watching, someone close enough to slip a warning under the door without being seen. He didn't show it to his mother, not yet, but he laid it on the workbench where Alvarez would see it. By morning, the sergeant's jaw was set like steel. Holt read it in silence, then folded it and slid it into his breast pocket without a word. But the air shifted. The easy banter of the past days turned into a quiet readiness. Every sound outside the barn drew a glance toward the door. On Friday, they doubled their efforts. Z reinforcing the tail rotor bracket, Maya recalibrating the pitch controls, Holt making calls from the far corner in a low voice. John sat in his usual chair, but his eyes were sharper now, scanning for more than just mechanical flaws. When Caleb asked if they should take the note seriously, John leaned in and said, "Son, anytime you build something worth keeping, you'll find someone who'd rather see it broken. What matters is whether you let them that evening." Just as they were rolling the Huey forward for clearance checks, a pickup slowed at the edge of the road, the driver a shadow behind tinted glass. It idled long enough for Caleb to feel the hair rise on his neck before it eased away. No plate visible in the fading light. Alvarez stood in the doorway until the taillights vanished. His hand resting on the hammer loop at his belt, they worked. Another hour before deciding to lock up, Maya took home the laptop with all the schematics. Holt suggested they start parking vehicles across the barn doors at night. Just in case Saturday dawned bright and cool, the kind of morning that made the valley look like a painting. But inside the barn, the tension was a wire drawn tight. They had one more day before Wallace the inspector returned, one day to prove they could meet every code, every fire regulation, every clearance, and still keep the dream alive. Pastor Glenn stopped by with a bag of breakfast biscuits and a short prayer over the machine. He ended it with a line that stuck to Caleb's. "Ribs, sometimes the test is not to show you can fly, but to show you won't fold your wings before the wind even starts." By late afternoon, the last checklist items were falling into place. Extinguishers mounted, wiring in conduit, exit paths cleared and measured. Holt and Alvarez went through the barn like a drill team, pointing out spots of clutter, frayed cords, anything Wallace might latch onto. Maya marked each fix in her logs. Z tested the new welds with a grin. Caleb barely spoke. His focus narrowed to the thought of the Huey standing ready. Not perfect, but worthy of inspection. Worthy of the next step. When Sunday came, they were up before sunrise, Holt in uniform, Alvarez in his old flight jacket, Maya and Z in work boots and determination. John wore the same expression Caleb had seen on veterans during the 4th of July parade, pride mixed with caution. The rumble of the inspector's sedan carried through the valley like distant thunder. Wallace stepped out with his clipboard, the fire safety officer beside him, and behind them, to everyone's surprise, was Grant Ellison in a pressed suit, hands in his pockets, watching like a man about to collect on a bet. Caleb felt the weight of every hour, every bolt, every moment of doubt and hope stacked together. Wallace began his inspection at the east door, slow, deliberate steps, checking clearance, measuring extinguishers, tapping at wiring runs. The fire officer nodded here and there. Making notes, Ellison stayed by the road. Smiling faintly, when Wallace reached the Huey itself, he paused, hand on the fuselage, looking at it the way you look at a wild thing in a cage. Then he said, "Start your demonstration." Caleb climbed into the pilot's seat, the leather cracked. And sun faded, but to him it felt like a throne. Holt stood by the nose with a checklist. Maya poised near the laptop, connected to the diagnostic sensors. Z crouched at the tail rotor, ready to call out alignment. Alvarez leaned against a beam, arms crossed, but eyes scanning every move. John was close enough to see every dial, but far enough to keep his son in the clear. Wallace adjusted his glasses and gave a short nod. Begin, Caleb's hands moved with the kind of care most people reserve for porcelain or promises. Master switch. On, electrical systems humming through the wires. Indicator lights flickering to life in a sequence that looked almost alive. The rotor system still locked, but ready for the mechanical sweep. Maya read off voltages, temperatures, circuit integrity, her voice calm. Z confirmed tail rotor pitch control smooth with no bind. Holt signaled for the hydraulic sweep. Caleb eased the cyclic forward, the hydraulic whine steady. No leak, no drift. Wallace stepped closer, tapping notes onto his clipboard, asking about materials, emergency shutoffs, access points for fire suppression. Holt answered each question with the precision of a man who drilled recruits until they could answer in their sleep. The fire officer checked extinguisher pressure gauges, emergency lighting, and nodded. So far, no one had found a crack to wedge against them. Caleb risked a glance at Ellison and saw the faintest flicker in the man's expression, the smile thinning. Just a hair. Then came the critical part, the simulated rotor run-up without fuel. Caleb engaged the mechanical crank. The blades began their slow, deliberate spin, air moving through the barn in gentle breaths, building rhythm. Holt called out alignment readings. Maya tracked the sensor data on her screen. Every bearing, every gear, every link moving as though it had never been abandoned. Wallace watched in silence for a full minute before holding up his hand. Enough. Caleb disengaged. The rotor slowed. The barn fell quiet. Wallace conferred briefly with the fire officer in low voices. The two of them glancing at their notes. Holt and Alvarez said nothing, just stood steady. Finally, Wallace turned back, his voice even but carrying. Your setup meets code for a static restoration project, with modifications as listed. He handed Holt the sheet in writing, permission to continue work toward full operational clearance under FAA advisement. Caleb let out the breath he'd been holding since sunrise. Ellison took a step forward, his tone smooth. Well, congratulations. But I still expect you'll find it easier to sell the land than to chase this fantasy to completion. Caleb didn't answer, but Holt did, his voice like a steel cable. Sometimes a thing's worth isn't in what it costs or what it earns. It's in what it proves. Ellison's smile faltered, and for the first time, Caleb felt like they weren't just holding ground, they'd gained it. That night the barn lights stayed on long after the valley went dark. The team gathered around the Huey, not to work, but to talk. Holt sharing stories of aircraft reborn in unlikely places. Alvarez passing around coffee thick as syrup. Maya sketching out the next systems integration. Z already planning custom mounts for avionics. John listening quietly, eyes shining. It wasn't victory yet, but it was a battle won. Asterisk Ellison's next move came fast, faster than anyone in the barn expected. 3 days after the inspection, a formal envelope arrived by certified mail. Caleb's mother signed for it at the door, her brow furrowing as she handed it to John. The letter was short but sharp. Ellison's development company had filed an appeal to revoke their compliance approval, citing safety concerns and possible zoning violations. It was the kind of maneuver that didn't need to win outright. It just needed to stall them long enough for their momentum to die. Holt read the letter twice, jaw tightening. Alvarez muttered something about bureaucrats knowing how to win without ever picking up a tool. Maya was furious in a quiet way, already scrolling through zoning codes on her laptop. Z wanted to drive to Ellison's office right then, but John raised his hand. No, we fight him where he expects us least. Not with anger, with proof. They agreed to go public, not in a desperate plea, but in a way that told the valley this project wasn't a private obsession. It was a shared undertaking. Pastor Glenn offered the church hall for a community presentation. Maya set up a projector. Holt pulled together photos from day one too. Now, Alvarez cleaned up the Huey until it gleamed under the barn lights, and Caleb prepared to speak. The thought of it twisted in his gut. He had built machines, not sentences. But this time the machine wasn't enough on its own. The night of the presentation, the hall filled early. Veterans in caps, farmers in boots, high schoolers curious to see what the fuss was about. Even Wallace, the inspector, showed up in plain clothes. Ellison sat near the back, arms crossed. Caleb stepped to the front, hands damp, voice low at first, but growing steadier as he told them about his father's injury, about the promise he made, about the strangers who had become teammates, and the nights they'd worked by lantern light just to keep the dream from cooling Maya, followed with the technical side, showing diagrams and safety upgrades. Holt spoke about the historical value of the Huey, how it wasn't just a relic, but a living reminder of the service and sacrifice tied to the valley's own sons and daughters. Alvarez ended it by saying, "This isn't about flying a helicopter. It's about proving we still know how to build something with our own hands, together." The room rose in applause, the kind that felt less like noise and more like a vows and slipped out before it ended. But the next morning, the valley was buzzing. A local news crew called for an interview. Donations for parts and safety equipment began trickling in. Pastor Glenn told Caleb he'd never seen the town so united around something that wasn't a county fair. But Holt warned them, unity is a shield, not a sword. We still have to win the appeal. And that meant more inspections, more paperwork, more scrutiny than ever before. The call came on a Thursday morning while Caleb was tightening a stubborn bolt on the engine mount. Holt stepped outside to answer, a sound of his voice carrying low and firm. When he came back, his expression had shifted, not exactly smiling, but lighter. He clapped Caleb on the shoulder and said, "We've got company coming, and they're bringing more than just handshakes by Saturday." 2 olive-drab trucks rolled down the dirt road toward the Mason farm, the kind of convoy that turned heads in a quiet valley. They parked just beyond the barn, and out stepped a small Air Force crew in crisp fatigues, led by Chief Warrant Officer Teresa Kane, a compact woman with sharp eyes and the kind of no-nonsense posture that said she had commanded engines louder than most people's fears. Holt introduced her as a liaison from Beale's Heritage Program. Their mission was to support historically significant aircraft restorations that served a broader community purpose. Kane didn't waste time. She asked to see the Huey, running her hands over the fuselage like she was reading its story through the dents and welds. She asked Caleb about every modification, every material swap. Her questions fast but never condescending, Maya handled. The technical readouts, Z explained the custom welds, and Alvarez just grinned in the corner like a man who'd set the table for the perfect dinner guest. When Kane finished her walk around, she nodded once and said, "You've got something here worth protecting. We'll help you keep it alive." Her team unpacked gear, calibration tools, test meters, even a portable balancing rig for the rotor assembly. In a matter of hours, they'd confirmed adjustments. The team had made and offered suggestions to shave weight and improve stability. Kane also handed Holt a folder thick with stamped documents, official endorsements from the Heritage Program, letters from senior officers, and a note that any future inspections should be coordinated with her office. It was the kind of backing you couldn't buy, and Ellison couldn't bully away word of the air. Force's involvement spread like wildfire. The local news returned for another segment, this time with footage of Kane and her crew working alongside. Caleb's team, veterans, stopped by just to shake her hand. Kids from the high school brought notebooks and asked questions. It wasn't just a barn project anymore. It was a point of pride for the whole county. Ellison's reaction came quick. A letter to the editor in the county paper questioning the real motives of the project, claiming it was a military stunt to avoid regulations, but the words rang hollow, especially against the images of Kane helping Caleb adjust a rotor pitch link under the golden light streaming through the barn door. Pastor Glenn read the letter, shook his head, and said loud enough for others to hear, "A man gets desperate when his shadow starts shrinking." That night, as the sun dropped behind the hills, Kane pulled Caleb aside, told him the Air Force had no intention of taking the Huey away from the valley, but they believed in making it safe. Making it right, she said. You've built more than a machine. You've built a rally point. And people don't forget who gave them something to stand around. Caleb went to bed that night with the rare kind of tired that felt like progress. Asterisk, asterisk. It happened on a night, so still the crickets sounded loud enough to fill the valley, the barn. Sat in darkness, except for a single work lamp Caleb had left over the bench where the fuel control unit rested. They'd all gone home early for once, Holt insisting everyone get a proper night's sleep before the next day's rotor balancing. Around midnight, Alvarez's old instincts woke him, the kind that never really fade after service. He'd parked his truck by the road and slept in the cab just to keep an eye on things. A flicker of movement caught his eye, the shadow of someone slipping around the side of the barn. Low and quick, Alvarez was out of the truck in seconds. Boots silent on gravel, he saw the figure crouched at the barn's east door, working at the padlock with something metallic. "Hey!" Alvarez's voice cracked through the night like a rifle report. The figure bolted, sprinting toward the road. Alvarez chased, but the intruder dove into a dark sedan and tore off before he could catch the plate. He doubled back to the barn, heart pounding, to find the padlock sheared and the east door ajar. Inside, the fuel control unit had been pulled from its cradle and lay on the floor. Dented, one of the fittings cracked. It wasn't destroyed, but it would need repair before it could be trusted. Alvarez called Holt, who was there in 10 minutes. Followed by Caleb, Maya, and Z. Holt inspected the damage without saying a word, then finally said, "This isn't just opposition anymore. This is sabotage, and we treat it like that." Maya started scanning her laptop for security camera options. Z swore under his breath and began sketching a steel cage mount for the unit. Caleb just stood there staring at the dent, his jaw tight. John arrived last, leaning heavy on his cane. He looked at the damage, then at his son, and said, "They can't stop you unless you let this stop you." By morning, the valley knew word. Spread at the feed store, the post office, the diner. Pastor Glenn mentioned it from the pulpit, calling it a coward's act. People showed up with offers. A retired deputy willing to patrol the road at night, a rancher loaning a pair of motion sensor lights, a hardware store owner dropping off a chain of heavy locks and a box of security cameras. Ellison didn't show his face, but no one doubted where the trail led. The Air Force crew came back that afternoon, Kane herself inspecting the damage and promising they'd help source a replacement fitting. She stayed while Z built the cage, while Maya wired the first camera to a live feed. While Caleb cleaned and reseated the unit, the barn felt less like a target and more like a fortress by the time the sun went down. That night, Holt gathered them all around the Huey, said, "Every attack is a chance to harden your defenses. Every delay is a chance to double-check your work. The question isn't whether they'll try again. It's whether you'll be ready when they do." And looking around at their faces, tired, angry, but unbroken, Caleb knew the answer. The repairs. Started as necessity, but turned into something more. Kane's crew sourced the new fitting within 48 hours. Shipping it in a padded case like it was a crown jewel, Z installed it with hands steady as a surgeon. Maya recalibrated the sensors to compensate for the new components slightly. Different profile. Holt suggested they take the opportunity to run a full systems integration check. Everything electrical, mechanical, and hydraulic working together in one controlled sequence. Caleb spent the morning double-checking every bolt, every line, every gauge. John followed with his notepad, making small marks next to items Caleb had already cleared. It was a silent kind of trust between them, the kind that came from months of building in the same dust and sweat. By mid-afternoon, the Huey stood in the center of the barn, like it had been waiting for this moment all along. The test began with Holt calling out the checklist, Kane at the tail rotor, Alvarez at the main rotor hub, Maya at the laptop feed, Z with a wrench in one hand and a fire extinguisher in the other, just in case. Caleb eased the master switch. On, systems hummed, lights flickered alive. Hydraulics whined as they built pressure. Kane's voice rang out. Tail rotor smooth, no resistance. Alvarez followed. Main rotor bearings perfect. Then Holt nodded to Caleb. Time for the mechanical. Run up. The crank engaged. Blades turning slow, then faster. The barn filled with the rhythmic thump of air being cut by steel. The sound deepened, steadied, and for the first time since they'd begun, it didn't sound like a project anymore. It sounded like a helicopter ready to rise. John's hand tightened on his cane, his eyes bright in the golden light spilling. Through the door, Maya read out the data stream. Temperature steady. No vibration spikes. Electrical stable. Caleb's pulse matched the rotor rhythm. The Huey was breathing in its own way. The test ended after 10 flawless minutes. No faults, no alarms. Just the smell of warmed metal and the grins of people who knew they'd just crossed another invisible line. Kane turned to Holt, said quietly, but with weight, "If they can keep this pace and pass FAA review, this bird could see air again." Holt glanced at Caleb, then at John, and simply said, "That was the idea from the start." But outside the barn, in the cooling evening, Alvarez spotted a black SUV parked far down the road, too far for a plate, but close enough to be watching. When Alvarez took a step toward it, the SUV rolled away slow, dust curling behind it like a retreating shadow. The message was clear. Ellison wasn't done. He was just waiting for his next strike. The summons came in a thick manila envelope stamped with the county seal. It wasn't a casual letter this time. It was a formal notice of a zoning review hearing. Mandatory attendance, scheduled for just 2 weeks out. The language was cold and procedural, but the intent was sharp. Ellison had managed to push their case onto the county docket, framing the Huey restoration as a potential violation of land use ordinances. Holt read it aloud at the workbench, his tone even, but his eyes flickering with calculation. Alvarez muttered that Ellison must have friends on the zoning board. Maya pulled her laptop closer and started digging through county code. John leaned. Back in his chair, rubbing the bridge of his nose, Caleb felt his stomach sink. The project wasn't just about bolts and bearings anymore. Now it would live or die in a room where the loudest voice could sway the rules. Kane didn't flinch. She'd fought bureaucratic battles before. She said the key was documentation, photos of safety measures, signed compliance reports, letters from veterans, community leaders, anyone who could speak to the value of the project. Pastor Glenn offered to rally the town, organize rides for anyone who wanted to attend the hearing. Z said he'd stand up and speak if they needed him to. Even if public speaking made his voice shake, the next days blurred into a different kind of work. Maya printing binders full of schematics and compliance checklists. Holt drafting statements about the Air Force Heritage Program's endorsement. Kane recording a video walkthrough of the Huey's current state with commentary on every safety feature. Caleb spent hours taking high-resolution photos of the build from every angle. Alvarez tracked down veterans willing to submit written testimony, each one telling a piece of the Huey's history and what it meant to them. The barn still echoed with the sounds of wrenches and welding, but there was a new layer, the shuffle of papers, the clack of a keyboard, the low murmur of rehearsed statements. John took to reading Caleb's draft aloud in the evenings, fine-tuning the words so they carried both fact and heart. He told his son, "You don't have to make them love the machine. Just make them see it the way you do, one night after everyone else had gone." Caleb stood in the quiet barn, the Huey's shadow stretching across the floor in the pale light. He thought about the hearing, about the faces in that room, some already set against him, Others may be willing to listen, he felt. The familiar pull of doubt, then remembered the first time the rotor had turned under his hands. Remembered his father's nod, and the sound of the team cheering. He whispered to the machine, "We've come too far to fold now." And in the stillness, it felt like the barn was holding its breath with him. Asterisk, the morning of the hearing broke clear. And cold, the kind of air that made every breath feel sharper. Caleb barely touched breakfast. His hands restless as he packed the presentation materials into the battered leather satchel his father had once used for maintenance logs. Holt arrived in uniform, Alvarez in a pressed shirt that somehow still smelled faintly of jet fuel, Maya. In a blazer she admitted she had borrowed from her mother. Z in clean work boots and a welding jacket. John wore his service pin, polished until it caught the light. They caravanned into town, the Huey's fate riding with them in 2 trucks and a sedan. As they neared the county building, Caleb's heart sank. The parking lot was already full. People clustered near the entrance, some holding homemade signs that read "Save the Huey," others with arms folded and skeptical eyes. Pastor Glenn was there greeting folks, shaking hands. The sight steadied Caleb more than he expected inside. The hearing room smelled faintly of paper and polished wood. The zoning board sat behind a long table, 7 members with nameplates and varying degrees of interest on their faces. At the far end, Ellison sat with 2 men in tailored suits, his expression calm in the way predators often are before they move. The board chair rapped her gavel and called the meeting to order, stating the matter before them: to determine whether the restoration of a military aircraft on agricultural zoned land posed safety or compliance concerns warranting a cease. Order Ellison's team went first, their lawyer speaking in smooth tones about zoning intent, about noise and safety hazards, about the slippery slope of allowing such projects without tighter restrictions. They presented photos taken from angles that made the barn look cluttered and chaotic, implying danger without ever stating it outright. Caleb clenched his fists under the table. Holt leaned closer and murmured, "Don't let them bait you. We answer with facts, not heat." When it was their turn, Kane stepped forward first, laying out the Air Force Heritage Program's endorsement, compliance records from the inspector, detailed photos of safety upgrades. Holt followed with testimony about the Huey's historical significance and the community involvement. Maya presented the technical logs, explaining each safety system in plain language. And then it was Caleb's turn. He stood, the satchel strap cutting across his shoulder, and told them about his father's injury, about the promise he made, about the nights they worked with hands numb from cold, and the mornings they started over when something failed. He spoke not like a lawyer, but like someone who had bled for what he built. When he finished, the room was quiet for a breath. Then one of the older board members nodded slowly and said, "Thank you, son." The chair announced they would deliberate after hearing from the public. The first speaker was Pastor Glenn, his voice steady as he said, "This isn't just a machine. It's a reminder of what we can do together." Applause broke out, and though the gavel called for order, the warmth in the room was real. The public comment period became a wave, the first few voices polite and measured, but soon the room filled with stories that carried weight. A Vietnam veteran named Frank Delgado stepped up, his gait slow but his voice strong, as he told the board how Huey's had pulled him out of the jungle after a firefight, how the sound of those rotors was the sound of home. A local farmer named Ruth Callahan spoke about bringing her grandson to see the restoration, how it lit a fire in the boy to learn about engineering and history. One by one, people from every corner of the valley spoke. A retired schoolteacher, a young mechanic, a shop owner who had donated bolts and wiring. Their words wove a picture bigger than compliance checklists. It wasn't just about one machine in one barn. It was about a town deciding it still knew how to build instead of just buy. Caleb sat listening, feeling the knot in his chest loosen with each testimony. Then Ellison stood, Calm and smooth, his voice measured, he praised the community spirit, even acknowledged the team's dedication. But then he dropped his final card. An oversized photo, blown up on poster board, showing the Huey mid-test, rotor blades turning, a man standing too close without protective gear. He claimed it was evidence of unsafe practices, of reckless disregard for safety standards. His lawyers slid copies to the board, and for the first time, Caleb saw doubt flicker on a few faces up front. Kane reacted instantly, stepping forward to explain the context, pointing out that the blades in the photo were turning by manual crank, not under power, that the man in question was Z, wearing rated safety glasses and outside the danger arc. She presented the time-stamped video from Maya's laptop to prove it. Holt added that this was exactly why they documented every test, to avoid misrepresentation. The board chair called a short recess to review the new evidence. The team gathered in the corner of the room. Caleb's pulse pounding, Holt told him to breathe. Kane assured them the video spoke for itself. Maya muttered that Ellison's move was desperate. And desperate meant they were close to winning. When the board returned, the chair's face was unreadable. She thanked all parties for their presentations and announced the vote would be taken immediately. The room held its breath. Pastor Glenn bowed his head. John's hand found Caleb's shoulder. Holt stood straight as a parade ground. The board chair's voice was steady, each word deliberate. The zoning board has reviewed all testimony, evidence, and relevant codes by a vote of 5-2. We find that the restoration project in question is in compliance with current zoning and safety requirements under the condition that all FAA oversight continues and that quarterly reports be submitted to this board. For a moment, there was only silence. Then the sound of applause swelled from the back of the room. Chairs scraping, voices rising. Caleb felt the weight slide off his shoulders. Holt shook his hand once, firm and proud. Alvarez grinned like a man watching a storm miss his field. Maya hugged Z hard enough to make his welding jacket creak. Kane simply nodded, but the approval in her eyes said everything. Ellison didn't clap. He stood, gathered his papers, and walked out with his lawyers. No words, no backward glance. But Caleb knew this wasn't the last time they'd see him. The man had too much pride and too much money to quit. And yet, for now, the barn was theirs. Outside, the sun felt different. Warmer, brighter. People gathered on the courthouse steps congratulating them. Pastor Glenn clasped Caleb's hand and told him, "You've proven something far beyond this machine. You've shown a town what it still can be." Back at the barn that evening, the Huey sat bathed in the gold of the setting sun. The team didn't dive into work right away. Instead, they stood around her like you stand around a fire, just soaking. In the heat, Holt outlined the next phase: rotor balancing, avionics integration, final FA inspection. But his voice carried an ease that hadn't been there before, the kind that comes when you've fought and lived to fight the next day. John leaned against the workbench, cane in hand, and said to Caleb, "I told you it wasn't about making them love the machine. It was about making them see it." Caleb smiled, because for the first time, he knew his father saw it too, exactly as he did. The invitation arrived in an envelope that looked too official to be mistaken for junk mail, the return address stamped with the crest of Beale Air Force Base. Holt opened it at the workbench, with everyone gathered around, reading aloud as the barn's light buzzed overhead. It was a formal request for the Mason Huey restoration team to present their project at the base's upcoming Heritage Day, a once-a-year event open to the public and military families, where historic aircraft and restored vehicles were showcased alongside active duty demonstrations. The letter made it clear they weren't just being invited as guests. They were being invited to display the Huey itself. The barn went still for a moment. Kane was the first to break the silence, saying with a small smile, That means they believe you'll be ready. Holt nodded but added, "It also means we'll be working to a deadline, a very public one." Caleb's pulse quickened at the thought, not just of the challenge, but of what it would mean to roll the Huey out into the sunlight for everyone to see. Maya immediately began, listing the remaining tasks: final rotor balancing, avionics wiring, cosmetic restoration for presentation. Z grinned and said he'd make the paint gleam like it had just come off the line. Alvarez warned them that transport alone would be a job in itself, moving a bird that size required permits, escorts, and precision. The next days blurred into a mix of mechanical work and logistical planning, Holt calling in favors to secure a lowboy trailer, Kane coordinating with base officials for hangar space, Maya sourcing decals to match the Huey's original markings. Even John got involved, spending hours at the bench cleaning small components until they shone. Word of the invitation spread fast in the valley. The diner's chalkboard menu had "Go Huey" scribbled at the bottom. Kids stopped by the barn after school to peek inside. Veterans offered to stand guard on transport day. One even offered to drive the lead escort vehicle. Caleb felt the project swelling beyond the walls of the barn, becoming something everyone had a piece of. But 2 nights before transport, a storm rolled over the valley, wind howling hard enough to rattle the sheet metal roof. And in the dark hours before dawn, they discovered a new problem, a small but dangerous crack in one of the rotor blade cuffs, invisible until Z's inspection light caught it. The kind of flaw that could ground them completely if left unchecked. Asterisk, the discovery hit like a gut punch. The barn was quiet except for the steady drum of rain on the roof as Z ran his thumb over the thin fracture in the rotor blade cuff. His face set in that way it did when he knew the stakes. Caleb leaned in to see for himself and felt his stomach drop. It wasn't just a cosmetic blemish. This was a structural fault, and if left unrepaired, the blade could never be safely spun at speed. Kane crouched beside Z, her voice low but decisive. "We have 72 hours until loadout. We can fix it, but not here. This needs a machine shop with the right equipment." Holt's brow furrowed. The nearest shop with the capabilities was over 2 hours away and already booked with contracts. Z straightened, wiping rainwater from his hands. "I know someone, but we'll have to go tonight. They don't do favors in the daylight by nightfall." Caleb, Z, and Alvarez were in the truck, the cracked cuff wrapped in padding like a fragile bone. The drive took them through back roads slick with rain, headlights catching the blur of wet trees and fence lines. They arrived at a nondescript warehouse lit by a single yellow bulb. Inside, an old machinist named Rafe waited, his beard streaked white, eyes sharp behind steel-rimmed glasses. Rafe inspected the cuff in silence, then looked up at Z. "You've still got bad habits, but you brought me something worth saving." He fired up the lathe, the hum of precision work filling the space. Alvarez brewed coffee on a battered hot plate, while Caleb watched every pass of the cutter. The hours slipped, passed in a rhythm of grind, measure, grind again, until finally Rafe held up the cuff. The fracture gone, the surface smooth as new. They were back at the barn before dawn. Kane and Maya waiting with fresh gaskets and hardware. The cuff went back on under the pale morning light, every torque reading perfect, every alignment dead on. Holt signed off on the repair, saying it was as sound as the day it left the factory. Caleb exhaled for what felt like the first time in hours. But the clock was still ticking, now down to 48 hours, and there were still the final checks, cosmetic detailing, and transport prep ahead as the rain eased, sunlight spilling. Into the barn, Caleb ran his hand along the Huey's side. The metal cool and solid under his palm. "We're going to make it," he said, and for the first time in days. Everyone believed it without hesitation. Transport day began before sunrise. A valley still wrapped in mist as the lowboy trailer rumbled up the gravel drive, its diesel engine echoing off the barn walls. the Air Force crew from Beale arrived. In convoy, 2 escort vehicles with flashing amber lights pulling in behind the trailer, Kane in her flight jacket directing the positioning like she'd done it 100 times. Holt double-checking the tie-down points before the Huey even moved an inch inside the barn. The Huey looked almost unreal, her olive-drab skin polished to a soft gleam, decals in place, the rotors locked and braced for travel. Caleb climbed into the cockpit one last time before transport. Running his hands over the controls, Z and Alvarez worked in sync, guiding the forklift as it eased the bird forward onto the trailer bed. Maya followed with a camera, documenting every step for the FIA and for the people who had supported them since day 1. By mid-morning, the convoy was rolling, the trailer's heavy tires crunching over gravel before finding the smooth hum of the highway. People lined the route out of the valley, waving flags, holding up hand-painted signs. Kids on their father's shoulders, pointing at the helicopter that had once been just a pile of rust in a barn. Caleb sat in the cab of the lead escort truck, every mile feeling like part of a victory lap. They were 30 minutes from Beale when the obstacle appeared, a highway patrol cruiser blocking the ramp they were supposed to take. An officer stepping out with a clipboard. He said there was a problem with the transport permit, a discrepancy in the paperwork regarding the rotor width. Holt stepped forward with the signed clearance documents, but the officer shook his head, said the order came from higher up, and until it was resolved, they weren't moving. Kane's jaw tightened. This was no coincidence. She stepped aside to make a call. Her voice low but edged. Caleb paced, watching the Huey sitting still on the trailer. So close to the finish line, Alvarez leaned on the truck, eyes scanning the road like he half expected Ellison's SUV to roll up any second. After 15 tense minutes, Kane returned, a small smile breaking through her usual reserve. "It's handled," she said. "Turns out higher up just got a call from a colonel who outranks whoever made that order." The officer cleared the way, the convoy rolling again, and as they approached the base gates, the sight of uniformed personnel saluting the incoming Huey felt like more than just welcome. It felt like recognition. Heritage Day dawned with the kind of clear blue sky that looked painted on. The base gates were already open by the time the convoy rolled through, the Huey gleaming on the trailer like a living relic. Kane guided them to a reserved hangar space, the kind used for prize displays. Crews moved with precision, lowering the Huey onto chocks, removing travel braces, and polishing away the last fingerprints from her skin. As the hangar doors opened to the public, the sound of footsteps and murmurs filled the space. Families in ball caps and sunglasses, veterans in flight jackets with patches faded by decades, kids clutching toy helicopters. Caleb stood off to the side at first, letting the crowd take her in. He watched as people ran their hands along the fuselage, as old pilots pointed out details to their grandkids, as camera shutters clicked like a heartbeat. Then Holt called him over. Time for the presentation. Caleb stepped up to the small podium set near the Huey's nose, his voice a little rough at first, but steadying as he spoke about the barn, about the promise he made to his father, about the nights they thought they'd never finish, and the people who showed up anyway. He spoke about what the Huey meant to the valley, how it had become a rallying point for hope and skill and community pride. When he finished, the applause rolled through the hangar like rotor wash, and in the front row, John stood leaning on his cane, eyes shining in a way Caleb hadn't seen since before the injury. Kane stepped forward next, presenting Caleb with a framed certificate from the Air Force Heritage Program, officially recognizing the Huey as a preserved piece of living history. As the day went on, people came in waves, asking questions, taking photos, telling their own stories. Z explained. The weld worked to a group of curious teenagers. Maya showed kids the 3D printed parts that made the restoration possible. Alvarez found himself swapping service stories with a retired pilot who'd flown the same model in Vietnam. In the late afternoon, as the sun slanted golden across the tarmac, Caleb climbed into the cockpit one last time for the day, not to start the engine, but just to sit, hands resting on the controls. The sound of the crowd a low hum beyond the glass. He thought about the first day in the barn, about rust and dust and doubt, and about how far they'd come. The announcement came just as the crowd was starting to thin. Kane had been pulled aside by a base public affairs officer. They spoke quietly for a moment before she called Holt. Caleb pinned John over, her expression unreadable, until she finally said, "You're going to want to hear this from them directly." A senior officer in dress blues stepped forward, introducing himself as Colonel Matthew Briggs, his handshake firm, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made the hangar seem to quiet on instinct. He said he'd been following the project since Holt first sent him photos months ago, and seeing the Huey in person had exceeded every expectation. Then came the part no one had seen coming. The Air Force wanted to partner with the Mason team on a traveling heritage program, bringing the Huey to bases, schools, and community events across several states. They would handle the transport and logistics. The team would remain as caretakers and storytellers, explaining the restoration and history wherever the Huey went. For a moment, Caleb thought he'd misheard. Then he saw the look on his father's face, surprise giving way to pride, Holt's slow grin, Maya's hand flying to her mouth, Z, muttering, "Now that's a road trip." Kane added that the program would also provide funding for ongoing maintenance and upgrades, meaning the Huey would never again sit in a barn gathering dust. The offer was more than just travel. It was a way to keep the heart of the project alive, to share it with people who might never set foot in Redding Valley. Caleb felt a weight lift. The end of the restoration wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of something bigger. Colonel Briggs gave them the weekend to decide. But in the quiet that followed, as they stood beside the Huey, John looked at Caleb and said, "I don't need the weekend. I've already made my decision." Caleb met his father's eyes and saw the answer was yes. They brought the Huey back to Redding Valley under a sky the color of burnished copper. The convoy slower this time, not from caution, but from the sense that every mile was a kind of farewell. Word had already spread about the Heritage Day success and the Air Force offer. So when the trucks turned down the main street, people were waiting, lining the sidewalks, waving as if the Huey herself could wave back. The barn doors stood wide open when they rolled in, and for a few days it became less a workshop and more a gathering place. Neighbors dropped by with pies and jars of sweet tea. Veterans came to run their hands over the fuselage one more time. School kids clambered onto hay bales to get a better look. Pastor Glenn led a short blessing over the helicopter, asking for safe travels and meaningful stops ahead. Inside, the team worked through a different kind of checklist, not repairs, but preparations for life on the road, spare parts inventory, protective covers for transport, laminated information sheets for display. Holt coordinated with Kane on the first stops of the tour. Maya backed up every file and photo to multiple drives. Z reinforced tool chests so nothing would rattle loose in transit. One evening, long after the visitors had gone, Caleb sat alone in the cockpit with the barn quiet around him. He traced the worn edge of the collective lever, remembering the first time he'd touched it, when the frame was still bare metal. He thought about how the Huey had carried more than just itself through this journey. It had carried his father's pride, the town's unity, the team's trust in one another. John's footsteps sounded on the wooden floor, his cane tapping. Lightly, he didn't say anything at first, just looked at his son in the pilot's seat, then said, "You know, we built this together. But it's yours to fly forward." Caleb nodded, the weight of those words settling deep, not as a burden, but as an anchor. By the final night, the Huey gleamed under the barn lights, chocks in place, travel braces fitted, decals bright against. The olive drab, the team stood together for one last photo before the tour. Kane snapping it on Maya's camera, the flash catching the dust motes in the warm air. It felt less like goodbye and more like a promise. The morning the Huey left the valley, the sky was a pale silver, the kind of light that made every color sharper. The convoy gathered at the barn just after sunrise. Escort vehicles idling, the lowboy trailer waiting with its heavy ramps down. Caleb walked the perimeter of the helicopter one last time, running his hand along the cool metal, checking tie-down points out of habit, even though he knew Z and Holt had already triple-checked them. The community came in waves. Farmers in muddy boots, school kids clutching notebooks, veterans in faded flight jackets, they filled the gravel. Drive and spilled into the road. Pastor Glenn said a short prayer, his voice steady but thick at the edges. And when he stepped back, the crowd began to applaud. Not the quick clatter of courtesy, but the slow, rolling kind that carried weight. Caleb climbed into the cab of the lead escort truck, glancing back to see his father standing just outside the barn doors. Cane in hand, eyes locked on the Huey. John raised a hand in a small wave, and Caleb nodded back, a silent promise passing between them. Then the driver eased the truck forward. The ramps clanged shut, and the convoy began its slow roll out of Redding Valley. The road to their first stop wound through small towns and wide fields, the Huey drawing attention at every gas station and highway overpass, people snapping photos, waving as they passed. By mid-afternoon, the convoy pulled into a regional airport, hosting a Veterans Appreciation Day, a kind of event where canvas tents flapped in the wind, and the smell of grilled food drifted over the tarmac. Cane coordinated the unloading, Holt and Alvarez guiding the Huey into position on the display line. Kids crowded close, eyes wide. And before long, the first veteran stepped forward, an older man with a cane and a ball cap stitched with the name of a unit Caleb didn't recognize. He ran a hand along the fuselage, his lips moving in words meant only for the machine. Then he looked at Caleb and said, "I flew one just like this, and it brought me home." Caleb felt something settle inside him in that moment. A quiet understanding that the barn had been just the beginning, that every stop ahead would carry new stories, new hands on the metal, new reasons why this machine mattered. As the sun dipped low and the rotors caught the last of the light, he knew they weren't just keeping history alive. They were carrying it forward, 1 mile at a time, and the journey was only just beginning.